What if everything you thought about elegance in the Victorian era was a filthy lie? Beneath corsets and lace, women lived through daily hygiene horrors, rituals so grim they'd turn your stomach. From toxic face creams to never-changing undergarments, each habit hid a deeper danger. And the dirtiest secret of all? You'll have to wait until the final chapter to uncover the unspoken horror no one dared admit. But before we dive in, let me know if you're enjoying this kind of long, gentle history. Feel free to tap that like button and subscribe, only if you truly love what I'm doing here. And in the comments, share where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your city. I always love seeing our little bedtime crew gathering from every corner of the world. Now lower your lights, maybe let a soft fan hum in the background, and settle in. Let's ease into tonight's quiet journey together. Chapter 1: The Soapless Bath. Imagine waking up in a dimly lit room, the stale scent of old linens and yesterday's perspiration hanging in the air. The fireplace is cold. The water pitcher, left out overnight, is icy to the touch. A Victorian woman stretches from under her layered covers and prepares for the day ahead. Not with a bath, but with a ritual far removed from what we might consider clean. There was no warm shower to greet her, no scented soap to scrub her skin. Instead, she reached for a dry cloth, dipped it in freezing water, and dabbed at her face, neck, and maybe her arms. It was a token gesture, a nod to cleanliness rather than a genuine attempt at it. Most days, full-body bathing was not even considered. Not because it was inconvenient, though it was, but because it was seen as potentially harmful. Too much washing, society claimed, could damage the skin, stir the blood, or even invite illness. Bathrooms, as we know them, were a rare luxury. In middle-class homes, the most one could hope for was a washstand tucked into the corner of the bedroom. It held a porcelain basin and jug, filled with tepid water poured in by a servant or the woman herself. There was no plumbing, no drain, only the slow and awkward process of splashing water from one vessel to another. Towels were coarse and reused repeatedly, often unwashed for weeks. Bathing was done in sections: face, hands, underarms, feet, never all at once. And even that was occasional. A full bath required heating buckets of water over a stove, carrying them to a wooden tub, and bathing quickly before the warmth disappeared. That level of effort was reserved for rare occasions, maybe once a week, maybe less. Soap, oddly enough, was treated with suspicion, especially among the higher classes. Harsh soaps made from animal fat and lye were abrasive, and many believed they were too strong for a lady's delicate skin. Instead, women relied on a cloth or sponge and plain water. Sometimes rose water or vinegar was used to refresh the skin, but these did nothing to remove dirt. The grime accumulated slowly, hidden under layers of lace and silk, and rather than scrub it away, women masked the odors. Perfume wasn't just a luxury, it was a daily necessity. Lavender sachets tucked into bodices, rose oils dabbed on wrists, and musk spritzed behind ears all helped create the illusion of cleanliness. But even these rituals weren't practiced equally. Poorer women had fewer resources and less privacy. Water had to be fetched by hand from communal pumps or wells. Heating it was a slow, smoky chore, so many skipped it entirely. Their washing was reduced to a quick wipe with a rag and perhaps a change of apron. The smell of labor clung to them: sweat, cooking oils, coal dust. It was unavoidable, and yet they were judged the harshest. The wealthier classes, who rarely bathed more than once a week themselves, turned up their noses at the stench of poverty. Cleanliness became not just a habit, but a weapon of social division. The illusion of being clean was more important than actual hygiene. Women's magazines of the time encouraged restraint. Doctors warned that bathing too often would weaken a woman's body, that it was unnatural for a lady to expose herself to too much water. Modesty was preached with every drop. Even when a bath was drawn, it was taken with undergarments on. The idea of being fully naked, even in private, was almost unthinkable for many Victorian women. So they sat, partially clothed, in lukewarm water, washing only what was reachable and modest. The rest was left untouched. Infections, rashes, and skin conditions thrived in these neglected corners, but they were accepted as a normal part of life. Dry rubbing became the compromise. Using a stiff bristled brush or a coarse towel, women were encouraged to rub their skin vigorously to remove dead cells and dirt. This method was praised for stimulating the skin and maintaining blood circulation. But it did little to combat the growing layer of filth. Dead skin, sweat, and bacteria clung stubbornly, especially in areas never washed with water. The underarms, lower back, inner thighs, these spots became breeding grounds for infections. And yet, many women believed this routine was healthier than soap and water. Perfume may have masked the scent, but it could not hide the consequences. Skin diseases, fungal infections, and boils were common. Body lice were a familiar nuisance. In the absence of proper washing, parasites thrived. And as medical knowledge lagged behind, many of these afflictions were misunderstood or ignored. A rash was seen as bad luck. A boil was treated with herbs and prayers. Few connected these ailments to hygiene, and fewer still were willing to challenge the traditions that caused them. Social expectations played a cruel role. A clean woman, it was said, was a modest one. A proper lady did not discuss her body. She did not acknowledge sweat, nor odor, nor the needs of flesh. To speak of such things was vulgar. To engage in frequent bathing was unnecessary, maybe even immoral. So women learned to endure. They powdered their skin to hide blemishes. They wore gloves to disguise grime under fingernails. They carried scented handkerchiefs to their noses, not to shield from others' stench, but their own. And they smiled through it all, upholding the illusion. For Victorian women, the bath became a symbol not of cleanliness, but of constraint. It was a chore governed by rules of class, morality, and silence. Women were trapped between what their bodies needed and what society allowed. And in that quiet tension, the dirt lingered. It crept under fingernails, built up behind ears, and soaked into skin until it became invisible, until it became a part of them. Over time, they stopped noticing. The discomfort dulled. The smell faded into the fabric of daily life, and the soapless bath became a normal ritual of survival. Even the rare moments of indulgence were not without compromise. Public bathhouses existed, but women were discouraged from using them. It was deemed unsafe, unclean, inappropriate. If they went, they did so with shame, cloaked in veils and gloves, rushing through the wash before being seen. Others relied on servants to bring warm water and set up a tin bath in the drawing room. But even then, the process was rushed, awkward, undignified. Privacy was a luxury few had, and comfort, even in cleanliness, was fleeting. In the end, what passed for bathing was not about being clean. It was about appearances. A lady who smelled of violets, powdered her neck, and changed her gloves appeared fresh, even if her skin had not touched soap in weeks. Society applauded her restraint, her discipline, her silence. Yet under the perfume and paint, her body told a different story. A story of sacrifice, of suppressed instincts, of a war against her own skin. And every morning, as she dabbed at her face with a cold cloth, she chose that war again, because the rules left her no other choice. Chapter 2. Hair washing once a month, if lucky. It was the symbol of femininity, pride, and social standing. A woman's hair in Victorian society carried weight far beyond aesthetics. Flowing locks represented virtue, discipline, and class. But beneath the elegant curls and intricate braids was something far less romantic. The truth was, those beautiful heads of hair were often crawling with lice, coated in dust, and saturated with oils, because most Victorian women only washed their hair once every few weeks. For some, once a month was considered frequent. Shampoo, as we know it, didn't exist. Instead, they relied on bizarre mixtures, and washing required an ordeal of effort. With no indoor plumbing and very little privacy, even rinsing hair was a challenge. A single cleaning session could take hours, and that alone was enough reason to avoid it altogether. In the meantime, women covered the stench and grime with scented pomades and powders, unknowingly trapping the dirt closer to their scalps. The sheer length and weight of Victorian hairstyles made maintenance nearly impossible. Women were expected to grow their hair long, very long, and never cut it. The longer it was, the more virtuous she appeared. But the longer it grew, the harder it was to care for. Washing floor-length hair in cold water was brutal. The effort required a second pair of hands. Water had to be heated in pans, poured into a basin, and then wrung through the heavy strands. By the time it was rinsed and combed, the entire day was gone. And that was only if a woman had help. Those without servants had to manage it themselves, stooping over bathtubs, catching water in cups, and using rags to soak their hair in spirits or beer, both of which were believed to improve shine. The results were inconsistent at best, and the process left many so exhausted that they avoided repeating it for weeks. Homemade hair cleansers were common, but rarely effective. A mix of lard and eggs, rubbed into the scalp, was believed to nourish the hair. Vinegar was used to rinse away dandruff. Rum, gin, or even kerosene were applied to remove buildup and kill lice. But these concoctions left powerful odors, and the residues clung to the skin and clothing. Without soap or proper rinsing techniques, women often traded one problem for another. The greasy aftereffects meant more powder had to be applied to cover the shine. That powder, in turn, attracted more dirt. It was a cycle of discomfort masked by perfumes and pinned curls. Few questioned the process. It was tradition, it was normal, and it was quietly miserable. Pinned-up hair might have looked tidy, but it trapped everything underneath. Once styled in the morning, it stayed untouched for days. Women slept with their hair in the same position, rarely letting it down even at night. Sweat accumulated at the scalp. Dust from coal fires settled into strands. Parasites nested in the warmth of hair never brushed out properly. When finally unbound, hair came down in clumps. Matted tangles had to be hacked through with combs made from bone or wood. Detangling was painful and time-consuming, but letting hair loose too often was frowned upon. A woman's hair was private, something to be shown only in intimate company. The result was a world where women carried layers of grime on their heads, hidden beneath hats, veils, and bonnets. Lice were common even among the wealthy. They thrived in the undisturbed warmth of unwashed hair. The itching was constant, and the scratching left small sores behind the ears and at the nape of the neck. Treatments were cruel and crude. Women applied mercury-laced ointments, tar-based shampoos, and even urine to rid themselves of the parasites. These methods were toxic, yet they were the best available. Combing lice out strand by strand could take hours. Servants were sometimes assigned the unpleasant task of delousing their mistresses. Children shared the pests easily, bringing them home from schools and infecting entire households. And yet, no one talked about it publicly. To acknowledge lice was to admit poor hygiene, and that shame weighed more than the discomfort itself. Hair powder made the problem worse. It was used daily, made from rice, starch, or chalk, and dusted onto the roots to soak up oil. It gave the illusion of freshness, even as it clogged pores and settled like grit against the scalp. Powders mixed with sweat turned into a kind of paste that hardened in the heat of the day. Removing it required scrubbing, but few dared scrub too hard for fear of damaging their precious locks. Some women developed scalp infections, cysts, and chronic flaking. Still, they powdered each morning, smoothed it down, and added perfume on top. Presentation mattered more than comfort. Suffering was expected, and beauty was always pain. For many women, wigs became a tempting solution. A well-made hairpiece, styled and powdered by a professional, could save hours of labor. But wigs came with their own horrors. They were hot, itchy, and often infested. Once secured tightly to the scalp, they allowed little airflow. The sweat beneath them soaked through wig caps and rotted the base materials. Lice could still find their way in. Wigs were expensive to maintain and had to be aired out or powdered regularly. Poorer women wore cheaper versions made of animal hair, which retained even more odor. Despite these problems, wigs continued to represent convenience and status, but they did little to improve hygiene. If anything, they added another filthy layer to the already suffocating daily routine. Even among those who could afford real hair care, knowledge was limited. Scalp infections were misunderstood. Hair loss was treated with tonics made from raw onions, garlic, or even turpentine. Dandruff was scraped off with combs, then forgotten. Bald patches were covered with strategic pins and ribbons. And if nothing else worked, women simply piled what they had into elaborate shapes, distracting the eye with height and symmetry. The surface dazzled, but underneath the scalp itched and burned. Some women developed open sores along their hairlines. Others endured migraines from the tension of tight styles. And still they pressed on because that was the price of being presentable. Clean hair became less important than beautiful hair, and beautiful hair did not require washing. It required patience, products, and silence. It required hours of pulling, wrapping, powdering, and spraying. It required that women never complain, never scratch too openly, and never admit to the lice biting at their scalps. Society saw only the final image: a neat bun, a glinting comb, a perfumed veil. No one asked what it took to maintain it. No one wanted to know what it smelled like up close. The illusion held fast, and the dirt stayed hidden. Public advice echoed this mindset. Ladies' manuals recommended brushing the hair 100 strokes a day, not to clean it, but to spread the oils from root to tip. Hair was believed to clean itself over time. Water, they claimed, was damaging, especially cold water, and hot water, unless used sparingly, was indulgent. These ideas were repeated so often that women began to believe them. Brushing became their primary ritual, even as their hair remained thick with buildup. The brush itself, rarely cleaned, turned into a grim object of its own, full of shed strands, dust, and residue from countless applications of pomade. Among the working class, things were even more dire. Hair was often kept tied in simple plaits, hidden under scarves. Washing was rare, and combing was rushed. Lice were accepted as part of life. Remedies were passed down, some helpful, some harmful. Kerosene became a common treatment despite its dangers. Singeing the scalp was another. Girls grew up learning how to hide the itching. Mothers checked for nits by candlelight. There was no glamour, only necessity. And though these women were looked down upon, their experiences were not so different from their wealthier counterparts. The suffering was the same, only the masks changed. Victorian hair care was not about health. It was about control. Control over the body, over perception, over discomfort. A woman's ability to endure the grime, the parasites, the endless rituals, was seen as a virtue. Cleanliness was less about water and more about willpower. Those who suffered quietly were praised. Those who complained were ridiculed. And those who simply let their hair down, literally or figuratively, risked being seen as wild, improper, or insane. So they pinned it up, powdered it down, and hoped no one would notice the truth beneath the curls. It is easy to romanticize the past, to imagine Victorian women as delicate beauties with flowing hair and porcelain skin. But the reality was far less pristine. Their hair held the secrets they could not speak. Secrets of pain, of filth, of a daily battle waged beneath bonnets and bows. And in that silence, the dirt remained, unwashed, unspoken, and woven tightly into the strands of every beautiful lie. Chapter 3. The curse no one spoke about: menstrual misery. She felt it before she saw it. The cramp deep in her belly, the heaviness creeping downward. Her body whispered the same truth it had every month, but she said nothing. Victorian women were trained not to speak of such things. Menstruation was an invisible burden, a quiet suffering carried in silence. It was not to be named. No one explained it to young girls until the moment it arrived, and even then explanations were vague, hushed, wrapped in shame. The monthly bleed was seen as unclean, unnatural, even dangerous. Women endured it with improvised rags, sheep's wool, or in the poorest cases, nothing at all. These makeshift items were rarely cleaned thoroughly. They were reused out of necessity, damp and stained, hidden at the back of drawers. The resulting odor, the risk of infection, the discomfort, these were private torments. And they were endured again and again with no relief in sight. The lack of sanitation turned menstruation into a breeding ground for disease. Blood-soaked cloths sat for hours or days against the skin, held in place with pins or belts. There were no disposable pads. No antiseptics. Washing was difficult, and drying fabric in private was nearly impossible. Women often hid their soiled rags under beds or behind stoves, where dampness and heat bred bacteria. The risk of infection was high. Skin became raw, prone to rashes and sores. Foul smells clung to the body no matter how much perfume was applied. Some women suffered from persistent vaginal infections or urinary issues caused by prolonged exposure to blood and bacteria. Yet doctors dismissed these symptoms as hysteria or female weakness. The real cause, filth and neglect, was never considered. The body was left to suffer in silence. Pain was another hidden agony. Without access to painkillers or modern remedies, women bore their cramps with stoic stillness. They curled into beds, bit their lips, clenched fists under layers of skirts. Warm compresses, when available, offered brief relief. But most had nothing. Pain was seen as a natural punishment for being a woman. To complain was to be weak. So they endured, work continued, chores were done, smiles were forced. And beneath it all, the dull ache of blood and shame pulsed without pause. For some, the pain was disabling, but fainting was easier to explain than menstruation. Fainting could be blamed on tight corsets. Menstrual pain, however, had no place in polite conversation. So women suffered behind closed doors, their misery invisible to everyone but themselves. Secrecy dictated every step of the monthly ritual. A blood-stained dress could ruin reputations. Girls were trained to check constantly, to wrap their garments tightly, to double up on rags. Still, accidents happened. The shame was instant, overwhelming. A red mark on a chair, a stain on a skirt, a trail of blood down a leg, each a moment of pure panic. Mothers scolded daughters for carelessness. Servants whispered. Girls cried quietly behind locked doors. Men ignored it, choosing blindness over discomfort. In public, a woman had to pretend it didn't exist. She walked with stiffness, afraid of leaking. She sat carefully, legs clenched. Every move was measured, deliberate. Her body was a ticking clock, and she could only hope it wouldn't betray her. Even medical understanding failed women during this time. Doctors knew little about menstruation. Theories ranged from bizarre to dangerous. Some believed that menstrual blood was toxic, capable of spoiling milk, killing plants, or causing disease. These superstitions only deepened the stigma. Women were discouraged from cooking during their cycles. Some were told to avoid gardens or even children. They were considered tainted, unstable, weak. Others believed menstruation released bad humors, purging the female body of sin. This belief reinforced the notion that pain and isolation were deserved. Medical advice often involved rest, fresh air, and moral restraint. Real solutions, clean cloth, hygienic practices, pain relief were never discussed. The truth of menstruation remained buried beneath layers of myth and silence. Isolation became a common response. Some families enforced strict rules. Girls stayed in bed or confined to their rooms for days. They were excused from church, meals, or family outings, not out of compassion but shame. Their presence was seen as inappropriate. Even among close friends, menstruation was not a topic for discussion. Sisters avoided each other during their cycles. Mothers passed down habits, but rarely understanding. It was a lonely time, both physically and emotionally. Women learned to internalize their pain, to minimize their needs, to see their bodies as inconveniences. And each month, they returned to that same place of isolation, resigned to it like a prison sentence. Menstrual blood was seen as filth, And so women were taught to scrub themselves harshly after their cycle ended. Cold water and vinegar washes were common. The act wasn't for comfort. It was a purge, an attempt to cleanse sin. These harsh rituals caused irritation, dryness, even injury, but they were repeated religiously. Some women used powders or perfumes to hide lingering odors, unaware they were causing more harm. The vagina, unprotected by knowledge or science, became a site of constant abuse. It was prodded, scorched, and scolded into submission. No one spoke of these wounds. They were hidden like the blood itself, left to fester in silence. Poorer women faced even greater hardship. Rags were shared among sisters or neighbors. Water was scarce, privacy was non-existent. Women bled while cooking, cleaning, and laboring in fields. Some used folded newspapers, grass, or even sawdust to absorb their flow. Infection was common. Death was not unheard of. Yet these women were dismissed as dirty or careless, as though their suffering was a choice. In truth, they had fewer options than anyone. Their bodies were burdened by poverty, by labor, by the sheer weight of being a woman in a world without compassion. Still, they endured month after month with grit, with shame, with no recognition of their strength. Education did little to help. Girls were often unprepared for their first cycle. Mothers avoided the topic, fearing it would encourage impropriety. Schools said nothing. When the blood finally came, girls panicked, thinking they were dying. Some ran to their mothers in tears. Others hid the evidence, terrified of punishment. Their silence became habit. They learned quickly not to ask questions, not to complain, not to speak of the red stain on their sheets. And so the cycle of ignorance continued, each generation repeating the silence of the last. Each girl becoming a woman who bore her monthly suffering in wordless agony. Menstrual products remained crude well into the late Victorian era. The first sanitary belts were stiff and uncomfortable, made from elastic and buckles. They chafed and pinched, and they failed often. Tampons, when they appeared, were rare and seen as improper. It was believed they might damage a girl's innocence. So rags remained the standard. They were washed in secret, dried behind locked doors, and reused until threadbare. Women learned to stitch them back together, to patch over stains, to hide the evidence. These rags became both armor and burden. They protected against shame, but carried their own quiet filth. And still, they were better than nothing. The psychological toll of this silence ran deep. Every month reminded women that their bodies were not their own. They belonged to custom, to superstition, to male-dominated medicine. There was no room for self-care, no space for comfort. A woman who asked for relief risked ridicule. A woman who acknowledged her pain risked being labeled unstable. So she pressed on. She worked through the cramps. She cooked while bleeding. She bled while smiling. And no one saw it. No one knew. That was the rule. That was the price of being respectable. Menstruation in the Victorian era was not just a private inconvenience. It was a silent nightmare, a hidden ritual soaked in shame and sealed with secrecy. It left women raw both inside and out. Their bodies bore the physical pain. Their minds bore the emotional weight. And each month, they faced it again, armed with little more than rags and silence. The blood was never just blood. It was a reminder, a warning, a punishment, and above all, a secret. One every Victorian woman knew, and none dared to speak. Chapter 4: Toxic Beauty, Lead, Arsenic, and Belladonna. The mirror was not just glass. For many Victorian women, it was a dangerous portal. One that stared back at them with expectations that could rot the flesh beneath the powder. Pale skin was prized, not because it was natural, but because it proved you were far from the sun, far from labor, far from the lower class. But achieving that ghost-like complexion meant reaching into the cabinet of poison. A woman might wake each morning and smear a paste across her face that would slowly corrode her skin. The creams were soft, white, and deadly. Made with lead, they promised radiance. They delivered decay. What began as beauty soon turned into sores, sagging skin, and trembling hands. Yet these side effects were accepted, even envied, as long as the final look fit the mold. Each day, countless women sacrificed their health for a fleeting illusion, all in silence, all while society praised the mask but never saw the damage beneath. It was not just the face that required attention. Eyes too had their rituals. Wide, glistening eyes were in fashion, but they could not be dull. So women reached for Belladonna, a plant-derived eye drop that made the pupils dilate. One drop in each eye, and suddenly they looked more youthful, more passionate, more alive. But Belladonna was no innocent potion. It blurred vision, caused hallucinations. Repeated use could lead to permanent blindness. Yet fashion demanded it. A dreamy, glassy-eyed stare was considered seductive. And if it meant losing your sight for the sake of a gaze, some were willing to pay the price. There was no science guiding these choices, only trends passed down like gospel. And once a look took hold in high society, it spread like a sickness among women who wanted nothing more than to be seen, even if it meant no longer seeing. Then came the complexion drinks, bottled elixirs of arsenic, mixed and marketed to the aspiring elite. A few drops promised a glow. A teaspoon a day was said to clear the skin. What these tonics truly did was corrode from the inside out. Arsenic in any amount is poison. It eats the stomach, weakens the heart, destroys the mind. But in the pages of Victorian beauty manuals, it was sold as hope in a bottle. Women who felt blemished or flushed would sip the poison with desperation. They believed it would cure freckles, fade spots, make them paler, smoother, prettier. And when the trembling started or the hair fell out, it was blamed on nerves, on female hysteria, never on the beauty routine that poisoned them day by day. The cosmetic industry was a wild frontier in the 19th century. There were no safety standards, no ingredient lists, no warnings. A jar of face cream might contain mercury. A rouge might be mixed with cinnabar or vermilion, both highly toxic. Lip stains were sometimes made from crushed insects or even coal tar dyes. Nothing was too extreme, nothing too unsafe. If it painted the perfect picture, it passed. And so, from noble ladies to shop girls, women applied these potions religiously. Their vanities were arsenals of destruction. But the true weapon was not in the jar, it was in the pressure to conform. The fear of being seen as plain, the terror of being overlooked. That fear drove women to burn their skin and blind their eyes for the promise of fleeting admiration. It wasn't only the upper classes who suffered. The beauty standards seeped into every corner of society. Servants, factory workers, and young girls alike began using diluted versions of these toxic products. Knockoff creams and homemade mixtures mimicked the elite, but carried just as much danger. Women mixed starch, flour, and white lead with water. They brushed coal soot onto lashes and rubbed crushed petals mixed with alcohol on their cheeks. Few understood what these substances could do over time. Fewer still had the means to stop using them once they started. Beauty had become both an addiction and a curse. And for those who could not afford the luxury of medical help, the symptoms of poisoning were often misdiagnosed, or simply ignored until it was too late. The real tragedy lay in how society responded. When women's skin peeled, when their hair thinned, when their health declined, the blame did not fall on the powders or the drops or the tonics. It fell on the women themselves. Doctors often claimed it was hysteria, too much reading, overexcitement, a weak constitution. Few dared to connect the dots between a glowing face and a failing heart. Even fewer acknowledged that the very ideals women were forced to chase were the same ones killing them. This denial was not ignorance. It was survival. To question the standard meant rejecting the only form of power many women were allowed, their appearance. So they stayed silent, and the poison flowed freely. Mothers passed down these rituals to daughters. With love, with pride, they taught them how to apply powder without smudging, how to mix the rouge just right. No one spoke of the dangers because to them it wasn't danger. It was duty. To be beautiful meant being desirable, and to be desirable meant being chosen, married, protected, elevated. The price of beauty was pain, and that pain was accepted as part of a woman's fate. These rituals were not just habits. They were inheritances, stories told in the form of creams and brushes, lessons written in the language of illusion. There were women who resisted, who tried to keep their skin bare, their eyes clear, their mouths unpainted. But society noticed and judged. A woman without rouge was considered sickly. One without powder looked unclean. Beauty, however toxic, had become synonymous with health, with morality, even with virtue. To be plain was to be suspicious. To be natural was to be rebellious. So even the skeptics often gave in. They dabbed on a little arsenic powder, just enough to blend in, just enough to survive. Resistance was dangerous, and beauty, no matter how deadly, was safer than standing out. The toll of these practices could be seen in cemeteries. Women who died young of organ failure, of mysterious illnesses, of wasting diseases. Their obituaries never mentioned the creams, the drops, the tonics. Instead, they spoke of fragile spirits and failing health, of delicate flowers who wilted too soon. But if one were to dig deeper, beyond the graves and into the vanity drawers, they would find the silent culprits. Jars of lead, bottles of arsenic, the unspoken legacy of a culture obsessed with appearances. A culture that punished its women for being seen, and punished them even more for not being seen at all. Today, the echoes of these rituals still linger. Though the ingredients have changed, the pressure remains. The expectation to transform, to perfect, to fit. And while modern cosmetics are far safer, the mindset still whispers the same lies. That beauty is worth any cost. That appearance defines value. That pain is part of the process. The Victorian woman may have powdered her face with poison, but her descendants have inherited something just as dangerous. The belief that beauty must always come with a price. And the more we look back, the more we see how little has changed. In the end, the Victorian woman's daily routine was not just about looking good. It was about survival in a world that valued image over health, illusion over truth. Her powders were masks. Her tonics were shields. Her entire appearance was armor in a battle she never chose. She wore her poisons like medals. She smiled through pain. And when her body finally gave out, it was not seen as the result of deadly beauty. It was seen as the price of being born a woman in a world that demanded perfection, even if it killed her. Chapter 5. Undergarments never washed. Beneath the elaborate gowns and tightly laced bodices, another hidden world festered. It was a world few dared to speak of, a daily reality layered in grime and discomfort. Victorian women wore multiple layers of underclothing, and shockingly, these garments were rarely, if ever, washed. Chemises, corset covers, drawers, and petticoats were stacked atop one another, trapping sweat, bodily fluids, and dust between layers of fabric. On the outside, the appearance was one of grace. But beneath it all, the truth was anything but clean. These garments touched the most intimate parts of a woman's body, yet hygiene took a distant second to propriety. Washing such delicate items was not just inconvenient, it was socially frowned upon. And the longer the undergarments were worn, the more they absorbed. Women carried this secret filth with them, sometimes for weeks on end. This quiet accumulation of sweat and odor became as natural as breathing, as if the smell of decay was stitched right into the lace. The corset was the centerpiece of Victorian fashion, and perhaps the cruelest culprit in this tale of daily grime. Tight lace to mold the body into an unnatural hourglass. It pressed skin, organs, and bones into submission. But what it also did was trap heat and sweat with no escape. Made from materials like whalebone and heavily stitched fabric, corsets were rarely washed, as wetting them risked warping their structure. They were worn again and again, sometimes by multiple women, passed down like heirlooms. Inside these sweat-stained prisons, the skin could break out in rashes, infections, and sometimes even sores. The pressure of the laces often left deep, reddened grooves on the flesh that took hours to fade, if they faded at all. Yet women endured, because modesty demanded it, fashion dictated it, and a clean corset? That was a luxury many simply never knew. Beyond corsets were the chemises, lightweight garments worn directly against the skin, meant to protect the outerwear from sweat. But they too suffered from the same fate. Many women owned just one or two, which rotated between wear and the occasional rinse. But even then, it was done hastily. Soap and water were reserved for emergencies, and the idea of washing underclothes frequently was considered excessive, even shameful. Drying them posed another problem. Without sunlight or heat in many homes, damp garments took days to dry, becoming musty before they were ever worn again. The layers soaked up not just physical sweat, but emotional exhaustion. Women wore their burden against their skin, in silence, and the chemise meant as protection often became the very source of irritation, harboring germs, bacteria, and the unmistakable scent of the unwashed body. Summers were especially brutal. As temperatures soared, women's bodies continued to suffocate under the weight of heavy fabrics and thick underlayers. There was no escape, no relief. Underarm sweat soaked through chemises and corset covers. Thighs rubbed raw beneath long skirts. Petticoats clung like wet rags to flushed skin. Still, the layers remained. Society demanded that modesty be maintained, even in heat that would make any sensible person strip down. But Victorian women couldn't afford sensibility. They could only endure. And with no access to daily washing, no antiperspirants, and no breathable fabrics, the summer months became a battlefield of smells and infections. Women learned to ignore the rashes that bloomed beneath the waistband, the itching that flared around the bust line, and the sour scent that rose from beneath their skirts. These discomforts were seen as normal, expected, even feminine. Then came menstruation, layering its own secret misery on top of the already unhygienic routine. Women would stuff makeshift pads into their undergarments, made from rags or old cloth, and wear them without proper cleaning. These cloths, once used, were rarely laundered with care. A quick rinse, a hang to dry, and back they went. But that wasn't enough to kill bacteria. And when these pads were pinned or sewn directly into the undergarments, the entire ensemble became a breeding ground for odor and disease. Some women had separate undergarments reserved for their time of the month, but most did not. They endured in silence. Soiled garments stayed on, tucked beneath the pretense of propriety. No one could see it. That was all that mattered. Laundry itself was a laborious process, reserved for outerwear or bed linens, not the hidden layers. Water had to be hauled manually, boiled over fire, then poured into basins. Scrubbing and wringing out fabric took hours, and washing delicate items risked tearing the fragile lace and seams. So women avoided it. It was easier to perfume their clothing, to brush off visible dirt, or simply to air out garments overnight and call them clean. Underwear was hung discreetly behind doors or under beds, not for sanitation but for secrecy. Cleanliness was not defined by smell or health. It was defined by visibility. If others couldn't see the filth, it didn't exist. This collective silence bred an invisible epidemic of bacteria and chronic infections. Even when infection set in, the link was rarely made between hygiene and illness. A rash might be blamed on diet, a yeast infection seen as a female weakness. There was no understanding of bacteria or the role unwashed fabrics played in spreading disease. Women simply accepted discomfort as part of being a woman. Doctors offered little help. Medical texts focused more on female hysteria than on female hygiene. Women who complained were often told to rest or to stop worrying so much. So the cycle continued. The garments stayed unwashed. The infections stayed untreated. And the silence grew heavier than the layers they wore. Social class offered no escape. Working class women might own fewer undergarments, making washing a necessity, but they faced the same barriers of water access, time, and modesty. Wealthier women had servants who might do the washing, but shame often kept them from asking. Discussing one's underclothes was considered improper, even among family. So the wealthy, too, let their lace yellow, their silks stiffen with old sweat, and their corsets go crusted with salt. The unwashed undergarments of Victorian women were not just about hygiene. They were about silence, about repression, about a culture that taught women to hide their bodies at all costs, even from themselves. When a garment was finally beyond wear, it wasn't always discarded. Sometimes it was repurposed into rags, stuffed into mattresses, or passed down to younger girls. Children wore hand-me-down chemises soaked in years of old sweat and oil. The cycle of inherited grime began early. A girl learned to accept the smell of musty fabric before she even reached puberty. By the time she became a woman, she no longer noticed the odor. It was a part of her, just like the laces she couldn't remove or the petticoats she couldn't wash. Dirt became a rite of passage, a silent lesson in endurance. Perfume masked some of it. Lavender sachets were sewn into corset linings. Petticoats were dusted with floral powder. Some women even rubbed their undergarments with vinegar to kill odor, though this often left behind a sour tang that only mixed with the existing stench. But none of it truly cleansed. It merely layered scent upon scent, like a bouquet rotting beneath layers of lace. The illusion of cleanliness was maintained, but the reality lingered in every thread. Victorian undergarments were a lie wrapped in silk, tied with lace, and worn with pride. But beneath that lie, the body suffered. The final cruelty was how the system punished women for the very discomfort it imposed. If a woman smelled, she was shamed. If her skin broke out, she was blamed. Her pain was a sign of moral weakness, her odor a reflection of her character. Yet no one questioned the garments themselves. No one blamed the corsets, the unwashed chemises, or the taboo against discussing hygiene. The fault always lay with the woman. She was expected to endure filth with grace, to suffer without complaint, to rot quietly beneath her gown. The truth remained hidden, just like her undergarments. Unseen, unspoken, and tragically unclean. Only in hindsight can we trace the invisible scars, the rashes that became infections, the discomfort that led to chronic illness. The women who lived in constant irritation, never knowing that the source of their suffering lay not in who they were, but in what they wore. Victorian undergarments were more than clothing. They were a symbol of silence, of a society that prioritized appearance over health, and of a history soaked not just in sweat, but in secrets.
Chapter 6. Rotting Mouths and Poisoned Breath. The morning sun may have lit up Victorian homes with golden warmth, but inside, the air often carried something far less pleasant. Beneath the lace and bonnets, behind the smiles frozen in sepia photographs, hid a secret few dared to mention aloud. Oral hygiene was not a daily ritual. In fact, for many Victorian women, it barely existed at all. The concept of brushing one's teeth each morning and evening was foreign. Toothbrushes were rare, expensive, and often made from bone or wood with bristles from pigs or horses. They weren't household staples. And even when used, they were more a novelty than a necessity. Most women simply rinsed with water or wiped their teeth with cloth. In the absence of knowledge or urgency, mouths slowly decayed behind closed lips. What lingered behind the pretty smiles was a swamp of rot, infection, and unspeakable odors that society quietly tolerated. Because appearances, not cleanliness, ruled the day.
The homemade remedies passed down among women were as troubling as they were ineffective. Crushed charcoal was a favorite, rough, gritty, and thought to scrub stains away. But it also wore enamel down to nothing. Vinegar was another go-to, praised for its bite but disastrous for gums and teeth. Others tried baking soda, salt, or even urine, based on old folk wisdom. Each method eroded the mouth in its own way. None offered lasting protection from cavities or decay, and there was no understanding of bacteria or plaque. Pain was simply endured. A sore tooth might be ignored for weeks, even months, until the infection spread and fever took over. In some cases, death began with an aching molar, and yet, many women smiled through it, powdered and primped, concealing a battlefield of infection behind their lips. The breath told a story the face tried to hide. Without floss, mouthwash, or even regular rinsing, bits of food would stay lodged between teeth for days. Meat, bread, fat, it all festered, mixed with the decay of gums and the rot of untreated cavities. The result was a stench that clung to the air like a ghost. In romantic courtships, lovers may have leaned in close, but quickly recoiled. Even children, nestled in a mother's lap, would have smelled the sourness of unwashed mouths. And yet no one complained. Bad breath was so universal it had become invisible, just another feature of the times. Women covered it with peppermint leaves, cloves, or rose petals, but the fragrance always lost the fight. The scent of death lived where teeth once shone. Dentistry existed, but it was a world apart from modern standards. Dentists were seen more as butchers than healers. A toothache meant a visit to a man with pliers, not a gentle cleaning. Anesthesia was crude or non-existent. Most extractions happened with a shot of whiskey and a prayer. Women dreaded the chair, often choosing to suffer silently instead. And when they did go, it was always a last resort. There were no annual cleanings, no preventative checkups. Just terror, metal tools, and blood. And afterward, the wounds were packed with herbs or cloth. Infections were common, but no one understood how or why. Losing teeth in one's 20s or 30s was expected, not exceptional. Smiling too wide became risky business. For the wealthy, luxury offered little more comfort. Gold fillings and porcelain teeth were available, but outrageously expensive. False teeth made from ivory, wood, or even the teeth of the dead were status symbols. But they rarely fit well and often stank of mildew. Wealthy women might own a decorative toothbrush laid out in a silver case. But it was more about image than use. Servants, meanwhile, had nothing at all. Among the poor, teeth were a temporary gift, not a lifelong companion. By middle age, many women had gaps, blackened stumps, or no teeth at all. This wasn't shocking, it was life. And still, the pressure to maintain appearances never relented. Powder, perfume, poise, but never a clean mouth. Children followed in their mother's footsteps. Tooth rot began young, encouraged by sweetened gruels and no cleaning habits. A girl might lose her first molar by age 10. By the time she married, she might already have a gap-toothed smile. And once she became a mother herself, the cycle repeated. Generations grew up never knowing what a clean, healthy mouth should look like. Decay became normalized, embedded into culture like corsets and petticoats. Teachers didn't instruct students on hygiene. Doctors didn't check teeth. It simply wasn't part of the Victorian worldview. So the mouth, so close to life's necessities, food and speech and breath, remained a blind spot, a forgotten battlefield. Even diet made things worse. Sugar was becoming more common, especially among the middle and upper classes. Tea with sugar, jams, cakes. All of it sped up the decay, and still no one made the connection. Women indulged in sweets during social visits, smiling through cracked molars. Pain was a private matter. At most, it might be confessed to a friend in hushed tones. But there was no expectation that anything could be done. Painkillers were crude, dentistry brutal. So they bore it, quietly, proudly, while rot slowly claimed their mouths from within. It was suffering made invisible by silence. There was, ironically, a certain elegance to the illusion. Victorian etiquette demanded that women speak softly, smile modestly, and never open their mouths too wide. This restraint, praised for its femininity, also served a practical purpose. Kept secrets hidden. Behind closed lips, disease could fester unjudged. Behind delicate fans and demure hand gestures, the stench could be disguised. The culture of silence wasn't just metaphorical. It was literal. Victorian women learned to hide their bodies and their breath. They became masters of concealment. But the cost of secrecy was high. It meant no change, no progress, no relief. By the end of the century, new ideas began to trickle in. Germ theory challenged old beliefs. Medical advances hinted at a future where mouths could be cleaned, diseases prevented. Toothpaste was being manufactured in jars and eventually in tubes. But adoption was slow. Many clung to old ways. Habit is a powerful prison, and the Victorian woman lived deep within its walls. Change came gradually through schools, through hospitals, through advertising. But for the vast majority of the era, dental hygiene remained a ghost of a concept. Distant, unreachable, almost unimaginable. What lingered long after the era had ended was the image. The dainty woman with porcelain skin, a parasol in hand, a gentle smile on her lips. But behind that smile was a truth few today would guess. A truth soaked in rot, odor, and untreated pain. The Victorian woman was not untouched by dirt. She wore it behind her teeth. She carried it in her breath. And in her silence, she bore witness to a century that valued appearances above health. The lie of elegance was polished on the outside, but it decayed at the root. And still, despite the rot, women endured. They raised children, hosted guests, danced and sang and served, all while battling invisible infections inside their mouths. That endurance is what lingers. It is what whispers to us now from across time. Not the perfume or the fan, but the sheer will it took to smile through the pain. In their silence, Victorian women survived. But their mouths tell a story history rarely dares to repeat. A story of decay beneath refinement, of suffering behind grace, and of poisoned breath behind every ladle-like whisper. Chapter 7. The final secret, corpse-like cleanliness in death. The strangest irony of Victorian hygiene was that a woman might spend her entire life cloaked in grime, only to be bathed thoroughly after her final breath. Death brought with it a kind of cleanliness that life never offered. When a woman died, her body was handled with an intensity of care it had never known while alive. Hands that once recoiled from the subject of feminine hygiene now delicately washed the corpse, combed the hair, and prepared the body with scented oils. In an era where modesty kept women from discussing their bodily needs, death opened the door to a ritual of full exposure. It was only in death that her body was allowed to be fully seen, fully touched, and fully tended to. Cleanliness, it seemed, was less a part of life and more a requirement for the journey beyond. The contradiction was haunting and, perhaps, telling of deeper fears. Victorian mourning rituals were not merely about grief. They were spectacles of cleanliness, control, and curated presentation. The moment a woman died, her filth-streaked reality was wiped clean. Literally. Undertakers or family women washed the corpse, trimmed the nails, cleaned the teeth if any remained, and often applied a thin coat of wax or powder to give the face a smooth, unblemished appearance. The hair, once matted from weeks of oil and dirt, was combed, braided, or styled into soft curls. It was the first time many were seen as freshly tended, the scent of decay masked by lavender or rosemary. Death demanded that a woman appear as she never had in life, pristine. And yet, this perfection was a hollow one, carefully arranged for mourners who had grown used to ignoring the smell of sweat and sour breath. The body was dressed with equal attention. Gone were the unwashed corsets and stained chemises. In their place, crisp linen shrouds or fine black gowns, often the cleanest garment she had ever worn. Underlayers were sometimes hand-sewn from new fabric just for the burial. Lace gloves covered calloused hands, and silk ribbons tied hair that had rarely seen a proper comb. Her shoes were polished, sometimes new. Everything was scrubbed and spotless, symbols of purity she had likely never experienced in life. This final appearance was more than ceremony. It was a reconstruction of a life that never was, a fiction sewn in fabric and soap, paraded for society's benefit. Post-mortem photography became a way to preserve this eerie transformation. A girl who had spent her days in soiled skirts and lice-filled hair was now positioned in a chair or cradle, her arms crossed, her cheeks pinched with rouge. The photograph was not just a memory. It was proof that, in death, she had been made clean. Families clung to these images, even as they ignored the discomfort it hid. The living woman might have suffered in silence, but her corpse was finally allowed to be presentable. Even infants were groomed to unnatural perfection, their tiny bodies cleaned of the dirt that poverty or neglect had left behind. One of the driving forces behind these rituals was the fear of miasma, the belief that foul smells caused illness. Ironically, this meant the dead received a level of hygiene purely to protect the living. Washing the body, applying oils, and sealing the casket weren't acts of compassion. They were protective spells against disease. But in the process, the dead woman became cleaner than she ever had been. The very fears that kept Victorian women from washing during life, fear of immodesty, of illness, of cold air, no longer applied to the dead. And so the wash basins filled, the scented water flowed. The practice also stemmed from the idea of spiritual readiness. Cleanliness in death was thought to purify the soul for what came next. Religious or not, most Victorians believed that the body needed to be presented at its best to move on. That meant scrubbing away not just the physical filth, but the memory of bodily functions. Death sanitized what life could not. Blood, sweat, menstrual stains, and all evidence of decay were erased. She would go to her grave as a porcelain doll, not the flesh and bone woman who had endured so much in silence. In homes without undertakers, the burden of this washing often fell to other women. Mothers washed daughters, sisters washed sisters, and sometimes daughters cleaned their mothers. These were acts of grief, yes, but also of guilt. It was easier to scrub a body than to face the reality that its owner had gone unwashed for years. The ritual became a form of penance. At last, they could offer what they had always denied her: dignity through cleanliness. And in doing so, they also comforted themselves. The messiness of a woman's life was erased with soap and cloth, leaving behind a shell that no longer shamed or offended. Embalming was rare for ordinary people, but when it was done, it was another step toward artificial purity. Chemicals preserved the illusion of freshness. They held the cheeks high, the mouth shut, the color warm. Death could now be delayed, the lie prolonged. Visitors would see a sleeping beauty, not a decomposing body. Even the stench was tamed. What lingered was not the smell of decay but of rosewater and clove. Death had become not just a cleaner experience, it was a performance. One that required hours of unseen, intimate labor. The funeral itself was staged with meticulous attention. Mourning dresses were ironed and spotless. Gloves were white. Parasols and veils shielded tear-streaked faces. The coffin, sometimes modest, sometimes lavish, was lined with satin. Flowers were chosen not for their beauty, but for their overpowering scent. The fragrance of lilies and lavender masked more than death. It erased the years of odor that had clung to the deceased. The crowd spoke in hushed tones, pretending they had known her as clean and graceful. They praised a hygiene that had never existed, clinging to the illusion until the last clump of earth fell. There's something haunting about the fact that a woman could spend her life living under layers of sweat, blood, and decay, only to be remembered as pure and pristine. It was a final, quiet erasure of truth. Her pain was hidden, her labor dismissed. Her body, finally visible, was no longer hers. In death, she became an object for others to mourn, to dress, to display. The reality of her hygiene, her suffering, was buried with her. No one dared to speak of the lice, the infections, or the stained garments. Only the lace shroud remained. And yet, behind the veil of cleanliness, the body told its secrets. No amount of scrubbing could fully erase the calluses on her hands, the scarring from untreated infections, or the worn skin where corsets once dug deep. Her hair, though brushed and pinned, still bore the roughness of years without care. If one looked closely, the illusion wavered. The truth, like mildew beneath wallpaper, always lingered. Even in death, her hygiene, or lack of it, spoke louder than anyone dared admit. The final bath could not cleanse a lifetime of neglect. The most tragic part of this ritual was its implication. Cleanliness, once seen as dangerous or unnecessary, became mandatory only after it no longer mattered. The care that was denied in life was lavished in death. But it was too late. The woman who had endured the stink of her corset, the agony of untreated infections, and the shame of bodily silence would never benefit from this final tenderness. It served only the living. They would carry on, upholding the myth of modesty, masking the rot with perfume, and waiting for their own final wash. In the end, the great Victorian secret was not that women were dirty. It was that no one cared until they were dead. The soap that had been forbidden became sacred. The water once considered dangerous was now poured freely. And the woman, finally clean, was lowered into the earth, leaving behind a world that feared her body and its truths. This last chapter wasn't about hygiene at all. It was about denial, a final performance to convince the world that, in the end, she was clean, even if she never truly had been.